Dr. Peters has been doing this work around reproductive justice for almost all of her adult career life. So she knows what she's talking about. We're really glad to have her as a friend of the council. More importantly, as a faith voice in North Carolina who is trying to give us new ways to frame the conversation around reproductive justice, because I believe that the language of Christianity has been hijacked. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Peters.
Thanks. Thanks, Jennifer. That is, in a nutshell, what I'm going to talk about. So, that's a fantastic introduction. So when we think about Christianity and abortion, for most people in our culture, what we think about is that Christianity is against abortion. That is the dominant frame of our cultural conversation. And that I am putting before you today is the problem. And that's the problem I want to help us think about how we got to, because we have to figure out not how to go back to where we were, but how to go forward to the next place we need to be. Because the place we were before wasn't that good either, right? So we have to figure out, how do we move forward into the next stage of this conversation? Part of the context for this conversation is acknowledging and recognizing, and part of, and some of you all may know some of the stuff I'm going to share with you today. I hope if you do, you will tell more people, and I hope if you don't, what you learned today, you will begin to share more broadly. Because it's the ignorance in our culture, it's what we don't know that is part of the problem. So one of the things I want you to know is that white mainline Protestants are overwhelmingly in support of legal access to abortion, 68% legal in all or most cases. Black Protestants are majority, 55%. Catholics, majority 54%, right? So Christians in general are in support of legal access to abortion. And for some reason, this just, it eats my pointers. I can't point things out to you. But you will see white evangelical Protestants are the only group of Christians here at 64% who are against legal access to abortion. And even there, that's not all of them, right? There's even discrepancy within that community. And it's even more important when we look at our minority religious colleagues to recognize that this is a huge religious freedom issue. Because particularly Jewish and Unitarian brothers and sisters, but also Buddhist and Hindu are majority. Muslim are a very slim majority here, but if we had time, we could go into the theological understandings of ensoulment in these different traditions, which is not at conception. So this idea of quote-unquote fetal personhood, the idea that there is an unborn child, this is theological language that's being put into our legal code that reflects a minority religious perspective, even minority within Christianity. So, is Christianity against abortion? That is, I think, the question of the hour. Most of you probably already know that the Bible doesn't say anything about abortion at all, period. And this is important. The silence is important because the Bible has a whole lot to say about a whole lot of other sexual things and things that have to do with marriage and family and reproduction and who you can have sex with and when you can have sex. And we know that people were having abortions in the ancient Near East when these texts were written. So the fact that it doesn't condemn it is a very important part of the history of our scriptural context. So the one text that we do have that even closely relates to this question is a text in Exodus where two men are fighting. It says that two men are fighting and a pregnant woman is struck. And she miscarries. Then the compensation for the miscarriage is up to the father. But if the pregnant woman dies, then it's an eye for an eye, right? That was a standard legal consequence if someone died, the eye for the eye. So compensation would be equivalent. And it makes it very clear that prenatal life was not considered equivalent morally to the pregnant woman's life. So when we think about then Christian history, this is where we begin to see places where abortion comes into the conversation. One of the primary places that theologians are talking about it in the Christian tradition relates to this question of ensoulment. When does the soul enter into the prenatal body, the gestating body? And there's no consensus on that. Theologians disagree. They don't really argue about it because, again, it's not a huge thing in Christian theology. It's often only mentioned in passing. Augustine talks about it a bit because Augustine is obsessed with heaven. What will happen when we go to heaven? Who will be there? Will we have limbs if you lost your limb, right? So it's part of an obsession around his concern around what happens after we die. So he asks the question, what happens to these miscarried, pregnancies or pregnancies that are ended intentionally? But it isn't a major focal point for him or for any other theologian until very, very recently in Christian history. It's often included in a general denouncement of sexual immorality, so they'll be listing out sorts of things, homosexuality, sex while menstruating, masturbation, and abortion, right? So just sort of a list of things that are included. But I think it's also important to recognize that when we talk about abortion today, we're not talking about even what they were talking about then, because pregnancy wasn't confirmed until quickening. Quickening doesn't happen until the 4th or 5th month. So when we're talking about 93% of abortions happen in the first 12 weeks, that wasn't even considered a pregnancy at the time. So if you even want to say Christian theologians were condemning abortion, it's not a parallel conversation. And largely what they were condemning was the idea that someone, through ending a pregnancy, might be hiding sexual sin, right? Sex outside of marriage, or, also just the notion that the purpose of sex was procreation. And so anything that interfered with that was a sin, right? So this idea about, we're talking about apples and oranges when we're talking about Christian history and when we're talking about abortion in the modern era. So I'm gonna hold on the CCS for just a minute to say also, in case you're not aware of it, abortion was widely available in practice in the U.S. Through the 1800s, and women were using it as birth control. They were using it to space their children because they didn't have really good forms of contraception. So there's a lot of documentation from physicians, from people who were taking care of pregnant women through their pregnancies, that women were having multiple abortions so that they could space out their children so that they could care for their families. And so this was part of what helped bring the birth rate down in the U.S. So it wasn't then until a group of physicians in the newly forming American Medical Association decided that women didn't know what they were doing. The parallels are astounding with the modern situation. They decided women didn't understand what they were doing when they ended their pregnancies, that they didn't understand that they were stopping the possibility of this baby being born. These were women who had already been pregnant and had babies. So they decided that they just needed to educate the women, and they needed to tell them that what they were doing was sinful and immoral, right? Had nothing to do with science or biology or medicine. If you read the statements that the AMA passes, if you read the lectures and the books that these physicians give in this context, it's all theological. It's all about ensoulment. It's all about you don't understand that you're murdering your baby, right? This is where this is generated in our country, and it's coming from Christian doctors who are promoting a theological understanding of ensoulment and gestation that has nothing to do with science or biology. So fast forward, so they're the ones who pushed through the criminalization, the laws that criminalized abortion in the mid to late 1800s. So fast forward until we get to the late 60s. How many of you have heard of the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion? Some of you. So it was a group of Christian ministers and Jewish rabbis who worked together to help women access safe abortions when they were illegal. So you could go to one of these clergy people, mostly men at that point, and they had lists of places that had been vetted, that they knew were safe, that they knew were going to provide clean procedures in clean facilities. If they ever had a complaint from a woman about their experience there, that place got taken off the list. So it was a way that clergy were helping women in need, but also making sure that they were helping them access safe abortion services. We also know that all the mainline Christian denominations are on the record in support of legal access to abortion. Now, we'll talk a little bit when we get to a conversation about justification about how those statements talk about abortion, which is still part of the problem we need to overcome. But they are all on the record to uphold Roe v. Wade and to make sure we have legal access to abortion. So the question for me really that is intriguing is, why is it that the whole country has accepted whole hog this definition, this understanding, this theological understanding of abortion that has been promoted by the Christian right? And so there's some reasons that are obvious, right? It's the evangelicals and the Catholics who have permeated our cultural consciousness with messages through billboards and bumper stickers and license plates, right? So the state is getting involved, and through their protests and through a very, very visible public presence. But they're also talking about it in their churches. They preach about it. They pray about it. They have Bible studies about it. It is part of the cultural consciousness of evangelicals and Catholics in a way that it isn't in mainline and progressive Christian churches, because we don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it in their sermons, don't want to put it in their liturgies, don't want to pray about it. And this then means we really have ceded the moral high ground to those people who are talking about it. So my current research project, I'm working on the Abortion and Religion Project, which I put together an interfaith or multi-faith team. So I'm white Protestant, I have a black Protestant colleague, a Muslim colleague, a Jewish colleague, and a Catholic colleague. We're interviewing women having abortions across the country from our faith traditions, because their voices are erased from the conversation because they're too afraid to tell anyone. So one of the things that we discovered, and then we started asking more people once we discovered this, is most of these women, the ones who say that it's a sin, well, where did you learn that? Did somebody in your church tell you that? Did your pastor tell you that? Did you learn that in a Bible study? No. It's cultural. So even the Christians that we're interviewing who think that it is immoral, it's not because that's what they were taught in their church. It's because there's this larger cultural sort of civil religion, civil Christianity that has come to dominate how everyone thinks about abortion. So one of the things I think it's important to acknowledge is that it's been weaponized. Abortion has been weaponized, and that is why women are afraid to tell anyone. Women who tell the stories about, they're afraid, even the ones who don't think they did anything wrong, who feel fine about their abortion decision, don't want other people to know. They're actually afraid it will impact their ability to get a promotion in their job, to progress in ways in their career or in their social circles that there will be negative implications. So you have this reality where we have created this, by weaponizing abortion, really created this cultural context of fear for people who are having abortions. It's also been politicized. So there are different arguments about, we could talk about them, about how it's been politicized and, you know, what was the sort of root way in which that happened. There are different scholars who have different arguments, but But the reality is it was, right? So when Roe was passed, people felt in Republican and Democratic circles almost exactly the same way. You had pro-life and pro-choice people in each of the parties. And they might disagree, but they weren't disagreeing about, is this a Democrat issue or is this a Republican issue? They were disagreeing with each other about the morality of abortion, which is certainly a question. We talk about all sorts of moral questions in our public sphere. That's fine. The problem then becomes when it gets put into partisan planks, and it becomes a litmus test for political power for votes, and it is used in the ways that it was weaponized to bring people to the polls, to further partisan policies and activities. We see this most clearly after the 2010 midterm election. This is the first midterm after Obama's election. And there's this a huge Republican wave across the country. And there are state houses across the country that flip. And so we have majority Republican state houses across the country, which immediately translates into restrictive abortion laws. You can see here, right? So here's the election, and it's just very clear that the majority of this legislation happens once Republicans get power in state houses. That is when we most see that this has become a partisan issue. And again, this is the background. The overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision, didn't happen overnight. It was decades of careful political planning by not just Republicans, but by the Christian right, who are seeking to define family in a particular way, which includes heterosexual male-female couples having lots of babies, and that they prefer they're white. So there is a very clear agenda that relates not only to abortion, but to anti-LGBTQIA policies and laws, to banning care for transgender people, to banning books in schools, the control, the desire to control the understanding of what a family is a very clear marker of the work of the Christian right that has a narrow definition that certainly isn't biblical, right? So, to the contrary, if we want to talk about biblical models of family, well, that's a whole other topic.
Don't go there.
Don't go there, right? So we're starting to go there in our current policies, right? Mm-hmm. So I have labeled this cultural conversation a justification paradigm, and I think it's really important for people, Christian or not, to recognize the Christian roots of the justification paradigm, because it affects all of us whether we're Christian or not. And so this idea that we are sort of this post-Christian secular country is belied by the ways in which the Christian values of historical values have been baked into our cultural consciousness in ways that people don't even recognize anymore, right? So I call this justification because when we think and talk about abortion in the country, there are some ways that people will say, well, okay, in that situation, it's okay. In that situation, it's okay. And it's largely related to, it's largely related, I'm going to talk about them in a minute, to a certain set of circumstances that have been culturally cultivated as appropriate. But let's also talk a little bit there. The theological justification for this comes from a particular interpretation of Genesis and the creation narratives that are rooted in blaming Eve for sin coming into the world, particular interpretations about painting Eve as a temptress, as someone who is a seducer, is sexualized, and also then is responsible for original sin, right? Is responsible for evil in the world. And there are lots of other ways to interpret this. As a feminist theologian, I love to reinterpret Genesis. This is not the only way we have to interpret it, but culturally, historically, within Christianity, this misogynist and patriarchal tradition is the dominant one. Even the idea of menstruation being the curse, right, traces back to the Garden of Eden, and that God cursed Eve with menstruation. What God actually says in the text is, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing and pain. You shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you, right? So there's definitely baked in there hierarchy and subjugation. But if we think about the first two lines, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing and pain. You shall bring forth children. This kind of story, a lot of the stories in Genesis, from those of you who went to seminary may remember this from your Bible classes. These are called etiologies. These are stories of origin that help a community or a people understand why the world is the way it is. So they knew that childbirth was dangerous. They knew that childbirth was very painful. This is a story that helps narrate why that is and how that is related to their relationship to the divine. And so it isn't just, or that interpretation, that patriarchal misogynist interpretation shows up throughout history. I have 3 choice quotes for us. This is from Clement in the 2nd century. Every woman should be filled with shame by the thought that she is a woman. The consciousness of their own nature must evoke feelings of shame. Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries, well, I don't see what sort of help woman was created to provide man with if one excludes procreation. If woman is not given to man for help in bearing children, what help could she be? And Martin Luther in the 16th century, the word and works of God is quite clear that women were made either to be wives or prostitutes. So we have a law, we have hundreds of years of Christian interpretation that has led to 2 pathways for women, right? You can either be a prostitute whore or a temptress like Eve, or you can be a virgin and a mother like Mary. And these are the pathways that have shaped Western cultural consciousness around female gender for 2,000 years. And so when we look at this idea of justification and its roots in Christianity, we're left with these ideas, right? All pregnancies are gifts from God. Prenates are full human beings at the moment of conception, and women are morally obligated to gestate when they're pregnant, right? So when we have this idea that women's purpose is to bear children, then women who want to end a pregnancy are painted as immoral or irregular or something's wrong with you, right? These sort of negative associations, which play into abortion politics. And the ways that people think about women who are choosing to end pregnancies. So now I want to get to this idea about how do we know that this justification framework is shaping our cultural conversation. The question that the pollsters always ask is, do you think abortion should be legal under any circumstances, legal only under certain circumstances, or illegal in all circumstances, right? So you have the illegal in all is the smallest line. It always has been. It's never been a majority perspective. There's very low tolerance for completely eliminating access to abortion. The next one is legal under any circumstances, which is also smaller, although you'll see it spiked after Dobbs. But the majority of people in the country since Roe v. Wade, right, since the 70s, have this sense that it should be legal under certain circumstances, right? So that's the justification, right? There's some times and places and situations where it's morally justified, and in other situations, it's not. Now, mind you, it's the same procedure. The same thing is happening regardless of what? your reason is. And so really what's happening culturally is that we want to judge people's reasons. We want people to behave in ways that we think are okay. Then we need to back up and say, okay, who's the we? Right? Who's the we who's deciding which circumstances are okay? I call them the prim reasons. These are the reasons that are justifiable for abortion. Prenatal health, rape, incest, mother's life, right? These are the ones culturally that people will allow, right? There's this sense of it's framed as tragedy, it's framed as the least bad choice, right? Sort of all these ways that it's framed that are negative, all oriented from an ethical starting point that assumes that abortion is morally wrong, without ever having established it or made an argument or made a clear case for that. But we know for this, we have longitudinal data, decades, people have had overwhelming support for these 4 reasons. So I talk about these prim reasons as dividing our perspective around women who have abortions into 2 categories, right? You're either tragic or you're damned, right? You either deserve our sympathy and our support or our castigation and our judgment and shame, right? You should be shameful. The reality is, thankfully, I mean, these are tragic circumstances, right? Absolutely. Prenatal health, rape, incest, mother's life, they are tragic. And they're also the minority of abortions. So what we're talking about is almost 75% of abortions in the country before Dobbs were the damned, right? So disclosure, I don't know if any of those women had abortions, but that's the point, because most of the women who had abortions, you don't know, you can't tell. It's something that happens before 93% in the first trimester. Most people don't even know. Like, no, people aren't showing. People don't know that someone is pregnant. And it's a private matter. And yet, now people are losing access across the country to the ability to make the most fundamental decisions about their bodies and their lives, and most importantly, when and if they want to have children and be a parent. So the justification framework is fundamentally flawed in so many ways. It distorts the conversation and impedes dialogue. I argue that it actually has created the pro-life, pro-choice binary, which I don't even use anymore because I think it's part of the problem. And what I'm encouraging people to do in moving away from justification is to leave behind all of the pieces of that seek to stigmatize, that seek to divide us, and that seek to try to put us into these camps. It harms women and pregnant people. We've seen that in the way that it creates stigma. But ultimately, as a Christian ethicist, I also think it's focused on the wrong moral question, right? It's focused on this abstract male question, is abortion right or wrong, right? We can debate this in the abstract. Women who are pregnant? That's not the question they're asking. That's not a real moral question. The actual moral question that they have to answer in a situation of an unplanned, unwanted, or problem pregnancy is, what am I going to do? And that has a time limit on it, and it has real consequences one way or the other. It is not an abstract question. It is a very material question. So where does that leave us? What can we do? One of the things that I think is the biggest problems culturally is that the political landscape is divided between this secular pro-choice position and this Christian anti-choice position. And it has erased any space for Christians who want to talk about supporting abortion. The media will rarely cover those of us who are trying to share this message. All the attention is given to amplifying this Christian anti-choice message, or really covering, the Planned Parenthoods and the NARALs and the secular movement that has larger platforms and a louder voice. So it's really important for Christians, as Christians, to use our voices because Christian theology is the linchpin of this debate. This stigma is deeply harmful and has moved into a situation where there are states who are forcing women to be pregnant. Did you all know that Idaho, I don't know where the status of this was, at one point in the last few weeks had legislation that was going to prevent pregnant women from leaving the state?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's fascist. I mean, it's terrifying. So it's stigma, but it's more than stigma, right? It's moving into martial law. So we need new ways of talking about pregnancy, abortion, and mothering and parenting. We need new theological frames for this. I just keep there. I think there are lots of religious people in secular pro-choice movements. I just keep encouraging them to talk about it as a person of faith, as a Jew, as a Christian, as a Muslim, because we have to break through that idea that religious people are against abortion. So we need to change the narrative. So I'm saying we need to not use the justification frame. As a scholar, I don't like it when scholars deconstruct things and then don't tell us where to go. So I always work toward, what do we need to do? We need to replace that justification frame with a reproductive justice frame. And so I want to tell you a little bit about reproductive justice. How many of you have heard of or know about what reproductive justice is? Okay, about half of you. So it was created in 1994 by a group of 12 black women. They were at a Clinton healthcare conference. The conference, I think, was a pro-choice conference, was working on the Clinton healthcare reform bill. And there were these 12 black women at this conference of hundreds of white women, and they found each other and they said, this language does not work in our community, right? This pro-choice language, because it implies that everyone has choice. And it's really a false choice. If you can't choose to keep a pregnancy because you don't have the resources, or you're in an abusive relationship, or your physical health is at risk, right? There are all sorts of reasons you can't choose to keep or continue a pregnancy. Then it's a false choice. So this language isn't helpful. But even more than that, it doesn't reflect the needs of the women in our community, because reproduction doesn't stop with birth. And our children are being raised in dangerous communities with gun violence. They're not safe from the violence of racism in our communities, in our towns, in our world. And in addition to sort of these frames around what's happening in our community, they also said, we also have this really long, meaningful legacy of both forced childbearing during slavery and forced sterilization. So there have been people controlling our ability to reproduce for hundreds of years. And so what they did was they came up with a new frame that many women of color have been working out of for more than 30 years. And it has three main pillars: the right to not have a child. So abortion is a central plank in the reproductive justice framework. But the important thing I want people to recognize is reproductive justice isn't a term to replace abortion. Right? Let me say that again. It's not just a new way of talking about abortion. If you aren't doing all of the things that the reproductive justice movement is working toward, then you're just doing abortion justice. You're not doing reproductive justice. And if that's where you want to be, that's okay, but don't call it reproductive justice unless you are also working for people to have the right to have a child, right? And so that's about living wages and affordable housing and, safe communities. I mean, we could just go on and on. Environmental sustainability. There are all of these ways in which, for people who find themselves pregnant in an unplanned pregnancy, their ability to make the decision either way that they want to make should be equal. And so there are all sorts of ways in which, and I could tell you so many stories from the women that I interview who said, I would love to continue this pregnancy, but I can't. I can't afford childcare. Like, so many women who have one child in childcare have said to me, it's $800 or $900. If I have another one, it's double that, right? One of them said that they asked into the sibling discount, it was $10. $10 a month you get taken off your bill. So it's just prohibitive. The Department of Human Services did a study about 3 years ago where they estimated every child, every year, costs about $10,000. And I kept reading the report thinking, oh, well, like the second or third's going to go down. It'll be like just $2,000 or $3,000 more. No, it's $10,000 per child annually. So, it's, anyway, The third plank is the right to parent in safe and healthy environments, right? Safe and healthy communities. So again, it isn't just about getting children born. It's also about making sure that they're able to thrive, that families are able to thrive and be safe and healthy in the places where they live. So they added a fourth one in more recent years, that's the right to human dignity. I don't always include that, but for this group I think it's important you know that as well. Which included in that is the right to sexual pleasure, which again, I think we should talk more about in church, right? We don't talk about the wonder of our sexuality, this gift that it is, and that it is, we should bring the Song of Solomon more often in the church. There are wondrous things about human connection and relationship, and our sexuality is a part of that. So that fourth pillar I do think is also important. So I am, because of the nature of what's happening in North Carolina, and especially today at the legislature, I am going to focus primarily in my next remarks on abortion justice and theology, but I want you to understand what the reproductive justice frame is, largely because it's part of the sacred community the sacred congregation movement that I will talk about in a few minutes. So I have a number of frames I've been developing over the past couple of years because we don't have this work. When I talk to pastors, many of them are support legal access to abortion, but they don't know how to talk about it because the language has been so owned by the religious right. So I think it's important to talk about motherhood as moral choice, right? About the idea that women are fully capable human beings who have not only human dignity, but the capacity for making moral decision makers. The title of my book is Trust Women, right? It's that sort of theological piece of we ought to be able to trust people to make the decisions that are most important in their life. The state shouldn't be dictating that. And that's a theological principle, this idea that people should be able to decide whether or not they are going to gestate and bear a child. And this relates very closely to my second theological tenet here. I'm Presbyterian. I come from the Reformed tradition. Covenant is a huge theological frame for me. And this idea that parenting is sacred, that it's a covenant relationship that one makes with your child, and then through baptism with the whole Christian community. This is a covenant that we enter into, and one has to be ready for that. Even for people who are willing to gestate and birth a baby and place it for adoption, which is 2% of people who are pregnant. When people are choosing between having an abortion or continuing a pregnancy, they're not choosing between having an abortion and placing a child for adoption, because the vast majority of them, after they have gestated and born a child, are attached and don't feel like they can place a child for adoption. So this idea of honoring parenthood and recognizing that it's sacred means that people have to be able to enter into that is an important aspect of the covenant and of that willingness to take on the burden of pregnancy. Because for many women, again, a bunch of the women that I interview, pregnancy isn't easy for a lot of people. There are some people who, not just have nausea, but vomit for 9 months and can't work You know, and if you're caring for children and you can't work and you're living on the edge already, it's just not tenable. I also think it's important to think about abortion not just as the least good option, but in many cases it's an act of love. And it can be an act of love for yourself, taking care of yourself. It can be an act of love for the children that you already have, that you're caring for. It can be an act of love for your partner. For me, my first abortion, I've had 2 abortions. My first abortion was right after I got married, and my husband and I were a mess. We separated the week after the abortion. I mean, literally, if I had continued that pregnancy, we would have divorced. You know, that wasn't where my covenant responsibilities were. They were to that marriage, and we went into counseling, and we're about to celebrate our 30th anniversary, right? So there are choices that people make for reasons that no one understands or knows. Certainly those legislators aren't considering how people are thinking through the decisions that they're making for themselves and their lives and the commitments that they already have. And then for many people, there are situations where abortion really is truly a blessing. It saves their life. I did a research project about 18 years ago where I interviewed women who had second trimester abortions for wanted pregnancies, where there were fetal anomalies. And those decisions were wrenching for many of those women. But they also recognized that it was a blessing that they could end those pregnancies. That it would have been torture if they'd been forced to continue a pregnancy that they knew wasn't viable. I had one woman who told me she didn't have her procedure in Virginia because she'd been told that nurses there, many of these women had labor and delivery. When you're very far along, it's often labor and delivery. And if she labored and delivered and the child breathed, they would take it away from her and do everything they could to save it. Even though the circumstances of what was going to happen with that child's life for however many months it was able to live were not something that she and her husband wanted to put that child through, right? So there are ways and situations where abortion is truly a blessing for people. And of course, it's a religious freedom question. We could talk more here. I want to finish this up so we can have a little bit of time to talk maybe. This is the fetal personhood piece, right? The invention of fetal personhood as a new move from the very conservative Christians who want to argue not simply that they believe this, but that this should be the law of the land, right? So this is a religious freedom question. And I would argue no one should ever be forced to have an abortion, but no one should ever be prevented either. So people's theological understandings are important here, and they need to be respected. I'm gonna, if you want more of this detail, I can share it. Sort of this is where we are. Certainly, abortions have increased post-Dobbs in North Carolina. The way that the legislation went through was anti-democratic. They swapped out an existing bill in committee to subvert the process. They rushed it through in 48 hours, which is shorter than the waiting period that they have for abortions. And Democrats were excluded from writing the legislation. It includes, it's going to change from the 12-week limit we have down from the 20-week limit we have now down to 12. It increases the appointments. It's going to reduce a week of access to medication abortion, which is now the dominant form of abortion in the country. And then all abortions after 12 weeks have to be in the hospital for no medical reason. There are new reporting requirements and clinic regulations that we could go into if you want. But there are also these stigmatizing exclusions around race, gender, and a Down's diagnosis. So one of the things that I think it's important for people who are trying to change this conversation is to know the facts. So almost half of all pregnancies in the U.S. are unplanned. So it's just remarkable the number of people who find themselves in a situation where they're having to decide what to do. And 42% of those are terminated. So if you've heard in the last few years that the abortion rate is going down, it is, but it's not because, well, it is because people are having fewer abortions, but that's because fewer unplanned pregnancies. When the unplanned pregnancy rate goes down, you have fewer abortions, but consistently about 40% of unplanned pregnancies are terminated. And 20% of all pregnancies end in abortion. And then it's normal, right? 25%, a quarter of women will have had an abortion by the age of 45. So who has abortions? Christians have abortions, right? So at the same rate that we exist in the population, mothers have abortions. 6 in 10 people having abortions already have at least one child. And while white women have the most abortions, Black and Latino women are overrepresented because they're overrepresented among people living in or near poverty. It's also really important to know that the average U.S. woman spends 2.7 years pregnant, postpartum, or trying to get pregnant. 2.7, that's nothing if you think about it, because fertility's really long. That's 31 years at least spent trying to avoid pregnancy. And we know that almost every woman uses contraception at some point in their lifetime. What we don't know is how bad contraception options are. When you go to your doctor and they tell you the failure rate, they tell you the 1-year failure rate. I made these charts for my book because when I found this out, I was astounded that failure rates increase over time. So the projected failure rate for a diaphragm over 10 years is 72%, right? The failure rate for birth control is 61%. So there are all sorts of women I'm interviewing who are like, yeah, I'm on birth control. Yeah, we used a condom. Yeah, certainly there are lots who are not using contraception, but there are a lot who are and getting pregnant anyway. So roughly 1.6 million unplanned pregnancies a year are due to contraceptive failure. So advocate is something that we can do. SP20 and religion, both here but also across the country, people are talking about the ways in which these bans both violate the Establishment Clause by codifying a minority religious position, and they also violate the free exercise of religion, the free religious freedom question. So these are the two different legal platforms that people are pursuing in different states. But the justification piece in this bill, and if we had more time I would go into more detail, but it's stigmatizing, it's cruel, it uses intimidation tactics, and it's medically unsound. So there are provisions where they have to read a script to women before they have their procedure. And imagine you are someone who had a fetal anomaly, who's already spent the last 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks at doctors talking through, making the difficult decision to do this, and someone has to read you that script right at your procedure. I mean, the cruelty is astounding. Intimidation tactics, not only are they requiring that the names of physicians and healthcare workers who are part of an abortion procedure be turned in to the state. Any doctor who diagnosed any fetal anomaly along the way is also turned into the state, right? The documentation is meant to intimidate healthcare professionals. So educate, my book, Trust Women, I have some copies if anybody is interested. That's a new reader that just came out in January that has both Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. It's got about 55 articles in it. So if you're studying this question, it's a good resource to help you do that. So as clergy and leaders, preach, teach, listen, amplify voices in your congregation and across the community. Write op-eds and speak out as a Christian. And then sacred. Those are these yard signs, which keep getting, I had to put them out again this morning. They keep getting stolen out of my yard. So if you want some, let me know. You might want to take more than one. Sacred is the spiritual alliance of communities for reproductive dignity. It's a new movement of congregations to help educate people in local communities across the country to create a grassroots movement that can parallel the organizing that has been done in evangelical communities over the past 30, 40 years to help empower and equip Christians in your communities, in your congregations, to talk about this issue with their neighbors, with their families, with their friends, but also in letters to the editor or in op-eds or other ways that you can publicly think about this space. The movement started in Texas, and those congregations took this pledge. In this sacred space, we respect and trust women. We promise that women who attend our congregation will be free from stigma, shame, or judgment for their reproductive decisions, including abortion. And we believe access to comprehensive and affordable reproductive health service is a moral and social good. So if you are interested in learning more about or becoming part of the movement, you can go to sacreddignity.org. You can sign up for the mailing list there. I'm also happy to talk with you. I'm on the board. We held a training a couple of weeks ago for congregational leaders in Chapel Hill, and so I'm happy to help you work with your congregation. Make sure that you are using this issue in your liturgies. The clergy consultation service is in the midst of doing a reboot to talk about how can clergy become involved in helping people access care, particularly in states where it's illegal. Clinic escorts. I escort once a month, and I wear my collar. And people are surprised. People just don't recognize that clergy. I never wear my collar. I wear stuff like this. But it's a visible witness. People can see you, and it shakes up their ideas. Write op-eders and letters to the editor, and be a welcoming space. The number of women we interview who say, "Oh, I couldn't talk to my pastor. I couldn't talk about this in church. Nobody in my church community would understand." Let people know that it's okay. And then I just want to end by saying abortion is not a political issue. Abortion is a justice issue, and it should be part of the justice ministries in every one of our congregations. All right, so I already went over, so I'm sorry. I'm happy to stay and talk. I also want to honor your time. If you need to slip out and take care of business, go to your next place, that's fine too. But I will stay if there's anybody. Yeah.
This vote is happening today.
Oh,
they
thank you.
At
Yeah.
4 o'clock at the General Assembly. They're asking women to come from all over the state, be in the gallery when it happens. I've heard rumors this morning that now they're talking about changing the time when the vote's going to be there because they know a lot of women are going to be coming. Mm-hmm. So when this is over, it's a perfect time for people to please go to the General Assembly building and be there, be present, because both the Senate and the House are expected to vote on it this afternoon.
Yeah, and if only one Republican takes a walk, they won't be able to override. And thank you for reminding me. I meant to say that. And the antis are asking people to be there at 3. So the earlier you get there, the more likely you are to get a space in the gallery. So yeah, I would love for you all to come.
So what do you think the chances of challenging these things on the basis of separation of church and state?
I am actually not enormously encouraged at the national level that will happen. Because of the current Supreme Court. I do think that state by state, if you see every place it's been on the ballot, legal access has been maintained. And so it's very clear across the country that people want access to be maintained. The problem in North Carolina is we don't have any mechanism for getting something to have a referendum. That's not part of our process. And so in our state, it's the long game. It's trying to convince, the lone Republican to take a walk. And if they do override the veto, we're going to have to start all. We're going to go back to square one on strategy. So. Yeah, I mean, I do think Planned Parenthood yesterday came out supporting the idea of expanding the court. That's one I think really good possibility to think about how you change the makeup of the court. Yes.
At my recent Democratic County meeting, I raised the issue of where are men in this issue, and all we have to do is ever look around the room or think women rightly are centered. I get that. But when I mentioned this, it struck a chord. how do we do that? There are a few organizations nationally that attempt that I've been learning about. But your thoughts on that particular subject, as I've understood some of the research, men in very significant percentages support access to abortion rights. But we don't know how to be allies, supporters, and advocates. One of the arguments is if we could activate at least a significant portion of men to become allies, supporters, that could also add significant momentum around this issue. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that on any issue, people across the board need to be involved in the justice issues. And I do think you don't want to have men taking the place of women in leadership, but there are many men clergy who don't have women co-pastors or assistant pastors, associate pastors, and they need to be speaking out in their congregations. And I also think that in our culture, men are listened to in ways that women are. So, you know, writing op-eds and letters to the editor are still important for men to participate in those kinds of actions.
Because this bad bill is driven by a majority of men,
that's
because
right.
they're the ones who legislate. No one is thinking that there are significant percentages of men who don't agree.
Right. And then the last thing I would say is one of the things that polls showed for years is that Republican pro-lifers would say to pollsters they would vote against someone on this issue alone. So it became a litmus test. Democrats never even approached. Just very, very small numbers of Democrats. Well, I mean, again, it was legal. They didn't feel like they had to. But I do think at this point, refusing to vote, I mean, getting Republicans to refuse to vote for Republicans, it would be really helpful, right? I mean, to push, again, that this isn't a partisan issue. That there are Republican women having abortions. It is, you know, and also just saying those things publicly, reminding Republican candidates that this isn't a partisan issue, that this is a justice issue. So I do think men need to be involved on multiple levels. I mean, part of this is also about registering people to vote. And changing, you know, the North Carolina map because it has been gerrymandered to control, and so we just got to keep registering people to vote. I mean, and that's something that takes hundreds of people, you know, walking the pavement and going door to door and driving people to the polls.
So if we're stuck with this bill, then what? What do we do?
Right, so 93% of abortions will still be, people seeking abortions will still be legal in North Carolina. I would not be surprised if next year they seek to make more bans if they make success here. And I do think that what we need to start amplifying in the public square are those 7% of people. Right? Who there's this sense of that the Republicans have marked this as a reasonable bill, right? So this is reasonable because most abortions occur. Okay, so that doesn't mean it's unreasonable that these 7% of people still need abortion care. And so not letting them get away with this idea that this is reasonable. Again, in my experience, there are so many people who don't know any of the statistics that I shared with you. When I just talk to people and they say, what do you do? And usually I say something really general, but when they push, I will tell them, and then I will start telling them statistics, and they're stunned because the stereotypes of who have abortions and why have created what I call the abortion imaginary, right? There's this sense of, we know who's having abortions, that is fiction. And pushing through that fiction, this is a long game, right? Culture change is what we're talking about, and it's gonna happen over years. And so there is an urgency to it. I talk to women weekly who need abortions, who are having abortions. I understand the urgency, but even if we changed the law tomorrow nationally, it would change nothing about the stigma that women face. It would change nothing about the shame that they feel. It would change nothing about the fact that it is still women of color who are disproportionately choosing abortion when we go back to the reproductive justice question here, right? So there are all of these issues that we need to keep working on because this is a long game.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Rita.